I've been doing a lot of trauma release exercises over the past few weeks, and it's been an incredibly powerful process. It's also been really exhausting. And I've been emphasizing in these videos that it's not the actual trauma release exercises that are exhausting, it's the emotional release process. The trauma release exercises, TRE as they're known, is just a tool, and it's a very effective tool for releasing emotions. So I'm hoping in the long term I'll be much calmer and more relaxed. And I'm hoping also that my energies will be more balanced. Because at the moment, one day I'm feeling quite energetic, and the next day I'm just feeling completely drained, and I never know which it's going to be. So today I want to talk about the reasons why I've had so much trauma, what traumatized me in the first place. And I'll also say a bit about some of the flashbacks that I've had in recent years, because they've been quite interesting. Flashbacks are absolutely not accurate records of what happened, but they shed an interesting light on the way that the brain records information, how the brain actually interprets what happened. So my trauma stemmed from a very scary childhood illness that I had from the ages of 2 to 4 years when I was really tiny. And first of all, I want to say that this is absolutely not about self-pity. I know that hundreds of millions of people experience trauma that's just as bad or worse than what I've been through. So this is more about the journey that I've been on and trying to work out, just trying to interpret what's happened. In fact, for years, for decades, I was actually in denial that I even had trauma, that I was traumatized by the illness. And my parents told me they thought I was, but I just didn't think I was because I never feared illness. So I just thought, well, I'm not frightened of illness, so I probably wasn't traumatized. I didn't remember anything about it, so I thought that was a sign that I hadn't been traumatized. But what was unusual for me was that I did always have supportive people around when the trauma was happening, and that makes me different from a lot of trauma survivors. A lot of people are deeply traumatized by different types of abuse, sometimes from their parents. And so I do consider myself very lucky and very privileged that I had the support of my parents, but also that my parents recorded what happened. And they didn't just tell me what happened, but they actually wrote it down when I was 4 years old. They wrote a document, 7-page document. And the reason that they wrote it, they typed it out, was because at that time I was better. By the time I was about 4.5, the doctors had found out what was causing the bronchial pneumonia, so they were able to cure me. But I was really visibly traumatized at the time. I was having lots of psychological problems, really bizarre things, and terrible, not just nightmares, but night terrors, screaming hysterics at various things. No one knew what was going to set me off. And some bizarre behaviour. I was identifying as a cat for a while, which maybe isn't so bizarre these days. So it was very difficult for my parents. And it wasn't known whether I would be psychologically fit enough to go to school. And that's the reason that my parents wrote this document, because it was to help the authorities assess whether I would be able to start primary school at the normal age and fit in, be able to cope with the lessons and everything. And obviously the socialising. And I actually did. I started school at the age of 5. I did still have some of the real terrible fears, but within a year, I think, I was completely so-called normal. I was well adjusted. I had lots of friends. I was very often very tired, so I wouldn't run around the playground. I would tended to just sit and read, and I had friends who would be the same. And I think the teachers had been advised that I would be, a little bit different and difficult to handle, because I just remember at that school that everyone was so warm and supportive. So I really did feel comfortable, and I ended up doing very well at primary school. I did well in the class, and people were really warm and supportive. And I would have play therapy once a week. I would go and see a therapist, and it was just me and a lot of toys. I used to just love it. So that probably helped as well. But apart from that, I didn't have any other sort of psychological help because at that time, it was the 1960s, this sort of thing wasn't really understood fully. I always felt that I had the best care. I felt really grateful to the people in the various hospitals I went to, and obviously to my parents as well and my sister for looking after me. But I don't think so much was known about the effects of illness and all that I'd been through. And so what happened is I just really coped. My system coped. And I guess the way it coped was by completely repressing all the terrifying feelings and stopping all the bizarre behaviour. I still had a lot of fears and a lot of the anxieties that came up later, especially in my teens. But I think that my system just completely repressed things. And it was so efficient at doing that. And that's really how I was left with the trauma, because I didn't really go through it. And that's no one's fault. That's just the way that things were. And that things are still today, I think. So I think that there were three main ways that I was traumatized. I mean, first of all, the illness itself. The fact that it wasn't just one illness where I got weaker and weaker and then I got better. It wasn't like that. It was bronchial pneumonia, but it came in attacks. So when it first started, my parents thought it was croup. And it wasn't as bad then. So it was treated just like croup. I would get a bit of throat congestion, and eventually I would get better. And then it would happen again, and then I would get better. But it started getting worse and worse. My father was from the Bahamas. So we actually went to the Bahamas as a family, partly because my parents wanted me to meet my grandmother, who was very elderly at the time. And the other reason was that they hoped that the warm weather would help me get better. It didn't. I think it was a really horrible holiday for my poor parents. And apparently I started getting ill on the plane on the way back. And then I got really, really ill when we got back to Britain. And, you know, each attack I had was worse. And I would get ill so quickly that, you know, my parents weren't able to take me to hospital because I'd be too ill to move. But it would all happen really quickly. So the doctor would have to come out. So what would happen is I would progressively start coughing, and then I'd gradually have to fight for breath. So it really felt like suffocation, and it felt as if I was fighting for my life. And then the doctor would come out and give me penicillin. And this happened. It started happening more frequently. So it was happening every 4 weeks for a while. And then eventually, towards the end of it, it was happening every 2 weeks. Apparently, according to what my parents wrote, it would happen every fortnight on a Friday. And then different types of antibiotics were used. So I always got better, but I would have to really struggle. And this is where the flashbacks came in, because a few years ago, probably 20 years ago, actually, I was staying in a B&B. I was traveling somewhere and I was staying in a B&B, and they had a really strangely shaped sink. And for some reason, the plug hole gave me the creeps, and I couldn't work out why. And on the last day there, I thought, there's something going on here. I want to find out why this plug hole is affecting me. So I just went, I literally had my cases in my hand, and I just went and looked at it, and immediately I realised, it's bizarre, but it's as if it was sort of shaped like a throat, and it had a sort of plastic thing in it to block it. And that, I think it just represented a blocked throat to me. And over the next few hours, these memories started coming back of me being ill. They're always sort of fragmentary when you have flashbacks. And it was me really struggling to breathe, just fighting to breathe. And that was the first time I'd realised that the illness was actually quite active. I'd always imagined that I was just lying flat on my back on the sofa or on bed, you know, feeling weak, maybe being sick. But actually, I was struggling to breathe. And the other thing was that I remembered I was making a weird sort of rattly noise that was coming from my throat. You know, as I tried to breathe, there was this horrible rattly noise coming out. So when I got home, I asked my parents about it. I said, I've been having these flashbacks, I think, when I was ill. Was I just lying there being weak, or was I actually struggling? And my mum said, because she always sat with me when I was ill, she said, oh, you were really flailing about. In fact, I sometimes had to hold you to stop you falling out of the bed. But she added, she said that when she had to go to the toilet or if the phone rang, because at that time there were no mobile phones, so she'd be away just for a couple of minutes. When she came back, I would just be lying motionless and I'd have shallow breathing, and she said it was as if I'd given up. And that used to really give her the chills. I didn't remember that bit. I just remembered me sort of struggling to breathe. And she also agreed that I had this horrible rattly noise when I was trying to breathe. About 15 years ago, I went to have thought field therapy. It was something that I'd read about in the local paper and I thought it sounded really interesting. So I booked a session for my fear of spiders and spiders' webs. And the therapist regressed me I think it was actually using EMDR, because that's eye movement and what is it called again? I can't remember. EMDR, eye movement desensitization. I can't remember. But you look up, you look down, you look up, you look down, that kind of thing. And I agreed. He asked me if it would be okay for him to try this, and I said, that's fine. And he regressed me, first of all, to the age of about 8, when I had a scary experience. I was actually out with the Girl Guides, and we were at the BBC for an open day. And suddenly we were expected to walk through this kind of this tunnel with mock spiders' webs. And I knew that they weren't real. But I just could not go through that tunnel. And I knew that if I said to anyone, like if I said to the guide leader, I don't want to do this, she would just say, oh, don't worry, they're not real. So I just thought the only thing I could do was to run away. And I just disappeared into the crowd and ran away. And I got into terrible trouble because everyone was looking for me. Everyone's day was ruined. But I couldn't talk about it at the time. No one really understood about phobias at that time. So then, after that, he said, we'll go back to the first time that you ever felt scared of spiders or spiders' webs. And it turned out that I didn't know what was happening because I was regressed to a time when I was obviously very young. And I just felt that I was lying down and it felt as if I was rolled up in loads of spiders' webs, like a carpet, almost like rolled up in a big carpet of spiders' webs. And I couldn't move. And I was just kind of going, I kept making weird noises like that, but I could not speak. And the therapist kept saying, describe what you're seeing, describe where you are, what's happening. And he was getting more and more agitated, but I simply could not speak. It was really, really strange. I was just going, and eventually he started getting quite panicky, and then he just brought me out of it. And as soon as he brought me out of it, I was able to speak, and I explained what had happened. I said, I don't know what that was about. I was actually quite emotional. I think I didn't even realise how emotional I was at the time. And I remember I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, and my cheeks were all pink and rosy. I just felt strange. I should not have driven home that evening because I remember it was quite far away from where I lived, and I got lost on the way home. I ended up driving on these country roads and there was fog rolling in, and I was thinking to myself, this is not going to end well. Luckily, I found my way home. But I should really have stopped and had a cup of tea or a meal before I'd driven home, because I didn't know what to make of this. This was 15 years ago, and I kept joking that maybe I was a fly in a past life or something. That was the only thing I could think about. It wasn't until a few years ago that I realised it would have been me in a freeze state. You know, you get either fight, flight or freeze. So I would obviously have been fighting to breathe when I was really ill. And eventually, especially when my mum left, I just would go into a freeze state. And the interesting thing is that I think that parts of my brain interpreted that as being wrapped up in a spider's web. And some of the things that my parents wrote corroborate this, because my father wrote a bit of this essay that I was mentioning. And he said he was obviously really exasperated I really feel for both of my parents, what I put them through. But he said that I would go into screaming hysterics if I had mud on my tights or fluff on my tights, or if I thought that there was fluff in the toilet bowl. And I know there were loads of other things that sent me into hysterics. But now, looking back, I realised the rationality behind those screaming fits, because my brain just thought that something had clung to me. It interpreted that suffocation as being smothered by something icky. And for a while, I remember when I was in the countryside and we'd go to a river. I love going to the riverside, but if there was scum on the river, you know, you get that sort of foamy scum sometimes, I would freak out. Anything that I thought could stick to you, it would send me into hysterics. And I think that when I started going to school and I started getting more relaxed, you know, and being better adjusted, that all of those fears turned into this fear of spiders' webs. That was a key fear. And when I found that spiders actually always had a little bit of spider's web on them, I think, and they spun the webs, I think that's when I started fearing spiders as well. Because I remember I wasn't initially scared of spiders. It was just spiders' webs until I was about 7 years old. So the second thing that traumatized me around that time was when I was 3 and the illness had just started getting really bad. And my mum actually had problems convincing the doctors that it wasn't asthma, that it was something different, because I would get ill so quickly that they weren't able to take me into hospital. So she was told the next time it happened just to take me into hospital as soon as the first signs started happening. And that's what she did. She took me to the local hospital. And apparently I was just taken out of her arms. Not immediately. I think she stayed with me for a few minutes and then they just took me away and told her that she couldn't wait with me. And she always said that just completely traumatized me. Eventually, my father came and rescued me, really, because I didn't get better. I was lying in this hospital bed. A local friend apparently phoned my parents and said that they'd seen me. It was a nurse who my parents knew, and my dad came in and just took me out. My mum was so upset about this. She said that she actually started campaigning for parents to be allowed to stay with their children in hospital. What she wrote about this event was, at the ward, Natalie was just pulled away from me, in spite of the fact that when she was ill before, I used to nurse her on my knee and sit up with her always through the night. So my mum said that my nightmares started at this point. In the essay that they wrote, she said that I wouldn't talk about the experience for a whole year, and that eventually she got it out of me. She said, Natalie eventually said I had taken her there and left her there for 3 weeks because she'd been very naughty and they had come and stuck things into her. This upset me very much, as I had never suggested leaving her if she was naughty. And in fact, I had therapy, which I've spoken about in my podcast. I had Jungian therapy in the 1990s. And this was one of the incidents that came up during that therapy process. And I was able to corroborate it with my mum. So I obviously was very traumatised by it. And the third thing I think that traumatised me at this time was later on, when I was about 4 years old and I was actually getting better, because they started taking me to a hospital in Glasgow called Stob Hill. And that was much friendlier to children, I think. It had sort of a really nice children's ward. So this incident is something that could be, maybe I haven't got the details right, but the way I remember it is that when I was in the ward and I was getting better generally, I used to play with another little girl who was also about 4 years old. And there was one day when we were called to lunch, and I just remember, I do have a really vivid memory of it. There was a wee table set for lunch and our mums were there and some nurses. But as we walked to the table, I just remember this little girl sitting down and she was just sick all over her dinner. And immediately they took her away. And I never saw her again. So I asked my mum, I said, what happened to that little girl that I used to play with? And she said, oh, she died. And she said it in quite an offhand way. And I just remember being so devastated about this. And my mum knew how upset I was and how fearful about death generally because of what I'd gone through, because I had literally faced death several times. So at one point she'd said that only old people die, and I immediately got a fear of old people. So it was so difficult for my parents, and I don't hold anything against her for this. But later on, when I asked her about the little girl, she said, what little girl? There wasn't a little girl that died. And she said this for years, and it wasn't until I had therapy in the 1990s that she said, actually, yeah, there was a little girl. But of course, she would have been really, really traumatized as well. It was horrible for her to think that I might have died. So another little girl dying, I can understand exactly why she didn't know how to handle that. Even though my mum was so emotionally intelligent, she was such a warm and loving person. I just think it was really difficult for her. So that, for me, felt really traumatic. That's another thing that came up when I was having the therapy in the 1990s. But, you know, that period, that Jungian therapy that I had changed my life for the better. It made me so much more confident. Before I had it, I had so many anxieties. I just had general anxiety disorder, but I didn't realise it. And it felt to me, the way I saw it at the time was, it was like putting on a cloak of confidence. It was brilliant, but it didn't fix me, you know. I do consider myself very privileged, not just to have had the support of my family through all that time, but also to have had that therapy, which I was guided into by my mum. She realised what I'd been through. She really understood it. And she had been encouraging me to have therapy for years. And as I say, I was in denial. I didn't think I had trauma until I got another phobia, which I really don't want to go into details about just now because it's just too complicated. But that phobia disappeared within weeks of going to the therapy. And it was related to my illness as well. I think at the time, I just thought I was weird. I thought that I was just a really strange person. In fact, I think I just despised myself. And I also, along with the anxiety I had, I was also very depressed. And now when I look back, now especially when I've been connecting with the emotions more, I think that because of all the fears I had when I was little and all of that bizarre behaviour I had, which seems bizarre and which seemed bizarre at the time, like I say, I identified as a cat. But now that's quite a popular thing. A lot of people identify as a cat. I really did. Apparently I used to walk around on all fours for a while and it was quite difficult. But now I realise it was part of the trauma response. It was because I was traumatised. So looking back, I really feel for that little girl. But for a long time, I didn't. I used to think that little girl was just weak. And I didn't think that about other little kids that were going through difficult times. But when I looked back at my own life, I used to really hate what I saw. And I just wanted to be strong and fit. And I think I've still got that drive inside me now. But I understand so much more about the trauma response now. And that's why I find it so fascinating. I think that with trauma and with emotions, with emotional release, it tends to be released in sort of layers. So in the 90s when I had therapy, I released a lot of it. And I was so much more confident. And after the therapeutic process had come to an end, I travelled around the world. And I couldn't really have done that before. I wanted to do it, but I probably would have been too anxious. But then later on, I got depressed again. So I think that there were still more layers of trauma underneath. I've been reading Peter Levine's book, Waking the Tiger, and It's so insightful. I think for anyone who's had this sort of complex trauma, it's it just describes exactly what's been going on. I don't mean about what causes it or how the brain reacts, because that's still something that no one really understands, but how it affects people. I've also got the book about that I mentioned before, Trauma is Really Strange, because it does seem really strange. But now that I realise that, for example, my arachnophobia isn't that I think a spider's going to bite me, it's because parts of my brain have a mind of their own. I think that it's almost as if my mind has a mind of its own. Parts of my mind have a mind of their own. Parts of my mind think that a spider's web in particular, or a spider landing on me and spinning a web, could suffocate me, even though rationally, of course I know that's not the case. But try telling parts of my brain that. It's much more difficult. And the other way of viewing it is the way that Peter Levine describes it, where there's a trauma vortex, and the system, the psyche, doesn't want to get drawn into that trauma vortex because it knows how dangerous that can be, or at least how overwhelming it can be. And a phobia is almost like a device set up by the psyche to prevent you going too close to that trauma vortex. And I think it's the same with people who have other so-called neuroses that come out of that have trauma at their root. I mean, Jung spoke about neuroses. Carl Jung, the psychologist, he believed that neuroses were related to the subconscious things going on deep inside. I've tried so many things over the years to help me with this arachnophobia. And I think that some things have helped to a greater or lesser extent. The thing is, sometimes with exposure, for example, graded exposure, you get really far along the hierarchy of exposure and somehow it sort of kicks back. So it's quite a complex issue. And the somatic approach, which is really the physical, the bodily approach of looking at the emotions and looking at trauma, for me, that's been an absolute breakthrough. Yes, I still do have my phobia, but I feel that this is really helping me to connect with the emotions around that trauma. It doesn't mean that the talking therapies were not also a breakthrough. I think both approaches are important. So I'd like to talk more about why I started using that sort of somatic body approach in another video.